Judge Franklin's courtroom in downtown Atlanta was unusually crowded that morning. The usual hum of paperwork and routine cases was replaced by murmurs and curious eyes as the bailiff called out, "Next case, Taylor versus the state." All eyes turned as Lena Taylor entered. Tall, composed, wearing a simple navy blue suit, she carried herself with a quiet strength. There was something in the way she walked. Not arrogant, not dramatic, just grounded. You could almost feel it. This woman had seen things, endured things most would never understand. She took her place, hands folded neatly in front of her, offering only a brief nod to the judge. From the gallery, people whispered. Someone said, "She used to be a SEAL, right?" Another responded, "Why would a war hero be in this courtroom?" Across from her stood Officer Jim Calder, wearing his badge with the sort of tight-chested pride that came more from habit than humility. He barely glanced at Lena, his jaw locked. The two hadn't spoken since the incident, and what that incident truly was. Well, not even the courtroom knew the full story yet. As Lena stood in silence, waiting for the hearing to begin, Jim leaned over to his attorney and muttered something with a smirk. Lena noticed. She didn't react. She never reacted to small things. That was something drilled into her during deployment. Stay calm when the room gets loud. State your name and rank, the judge said. Lena spoke clearly without a trace of emotion. Lena Taylor, former Navy SEAL, Petty Officer First Class. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Not everyone had known. Jim rolled his eyes. "Here we go," he said under his breath. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Officer Calder, is there a problem?" "No, Your Honor. Just surprised she brought her resume to court." Again, Lena stayed still, but her attorney gave her a glance, a quick flicker that said, "Hold your ground. Don't give them what they want." But then it happened. As the courtroom grew tense and the judge was shuffling papers, Jim moved around the table and, in what seemed like a mistake, or perhaps something more, his foot struck Lena's chair hard enough to knock her off balance. She didn't fall, but she caught herself on the edge, her hand clenching for a moment before relaxing again. A murmur of confusion spread. Was that on purpose? Someone whispered. Lena looked up at Jim, and for the first time that morning, she spoke with quiet. "Wait. You used to call that a warning shot in the field," she said, "but I don't flinch anymore." The courtroom went still. Even the judge paused. Jim looked away, suddenly focused on a stain on the floor. Something deeper was going on. Something no one fully understood yet. And Lena? She was only getting started. The silence in the room didn't last long. Judge Franklin, though puzzled by the tension, proceeded with a firm tone. "Let's begin." But even he couldn't ignore the energy shift, the way Lena had quietly reclaimed control of the room without raising her voice, without even moving from her seat. The prosecutor began outlining the charges: official misconduct, false reporting, and resisting arrest. But the words felt distant from Lena, not because she didn't care, but because they weren't the truth. And truth was something Lena had spent her entire life protecting. On missions, with teammates, and now, here. As the prosecutor spoke, Lena's thoughts drifted briefly back to that night. It had been a routine stop, or so it was supposed to be. She was driving home from a late shift at the VA center where she volunteered, wearing plain clothes and listening to an audiobook. Then came the lights, the siren. At first, Lena had cooperated, license, registration, polite tone, but Jim hadn't cared. He'd seen her skin before he'd seen her name. That much was clear. When she mentioned she was a veteran, he'd scoffed. "You people love making things up for sympathy." Now, in court, he wouldn't look at her. Lena's lawyer, Angela Reed, stood up. Calm, sharp, and precise, Angela was the kind of person who didn't need to shout to be heard. She requested the body cam footage to be played. That's when the unease began. Jim fidgeted. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the screen lowered. The footage played. Lena pulled over on a quiet street, hands on the wheel. Her voice, calm, clear, respectful. Then came Jim's voice, sharp, impatient, loaded with assumption, and then him pulling her out of the car. No resistance, only confusion. His tone grew louder. Don't act like you're special. You're not. Angela let it play. Every second. No fast forward. She knew the longer the silence in the room, the louder the truth became. Then the moment came. The part Lena hadn't told anyone yet. The part where, as Jim pushed her against the car, a medal fell from her bag onto the ground. Her Navy SEAL trident pin. Even the camera caught it, lying there in the light. Jim stepped on it without noticing. That was when the entire courtroom inhaled sharply. Even Judge Franklin leaned forward. Angela paused the footage. Your Honor, this is not a case of resisting arrest. This is a case of a decorated veteran being humiliated and silenced by the very system she served to protect. Jim's face was red now. That's not what happened, he burst out. Judge Franklin lifted a hand. You'll have your turn to speak. Lena still hadn't moved. She didn't need to. Everything was shifting now, and the question hung in the air like thunderclouds refusing to rain. Why had Jim really stopped her that night, and why had he tried so hard to bury it? The truth was coming, piece by piece, and Lena wasn't backing down. The courtroom, now dead silent, seemed to pulse with one question. What else hadn't been said yet? Jim shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence draining fast. He stared ahead, jaw tight, avoiding everyone's gaze. Lena, still steady, glanced briefly toward the gallery. She caught the eyes of a teenage girl sitting in the back, eyes wide, lips parted, notebook on her lap. The girl looked at her like she was seeing a kind of hero she didn't know could exist. Lena gave her the faintest nod. Angela rose again. We would now like to call Officer Calder to the stand. Jim stood stiffly and made his way up, the sound of his shoes against the wood louder than it should have been. Once seated, he looked at Lena for just a moment, then turned away. Angela began softly, with measured politeness. Officer Calder, how long have you been with the force? 17 years. Have you received any formal complaints in that time? Jim hesitated. A few. Nothing serious. Angela flipped through a folder and pulled out a sheet. You mean these 7 complaints, 5 of which involve use of force during traffic stops involving black individuals? Jim tensed. They were reviewed. I was cleared. Angela nodded. Reviewed, yes, but never challenged, until now. She paused. Officer Calder, did you know Ms. Taylor was a Navy SEAL before arresting her? No, he replied quickly, but she told you in the footage. He didn't answer. Angela stepped closer. Do you remember what you said after she mentioned it? She held up the transcript. You people love making things up for sympathy. That's a direct quote. Would you like to explain what you meant by you people? A few gasps echoed through the courtroom. I didn't mean anything by it, he muttered. It was a tense moment. Angela's voice remained even. You mean you were tense? Ms. Taylor was calm, respectful, unarmed. She let that sink in before continuing. Would it surprise you to learn Ms. Taylor completed 3 deployments, led a reconnaissance team in Syria, and was awarded the Silver Star for rescuing civilians under fire? Jim didn't respond. Angela faced the judge. Your Honor, the footage shows not only an unlawful arrest, but a deliberate attempt to intimidate and diminish a decorated service member, based not on her actions, but her appearance. Judge Franklin nodded slowly. We will take a recess. I'd like to review the footage personally. He banged the gavel once. 15 minutes. As people stood and murmured, Jim stood up too fast, bumping his knee into the stand. He winced, more embarrassed than hurt. He caught Lena's eye for the first time since the hearing began. She didn't glare. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at him like she saw right through him. And maybe that was worse than anger, because now he knew she remembered every detail. And she wasn't here for revenge. She was here for something far more difficult. Justice, with grace. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Lena stayed seated. She didn't need a break. This room, this moment, it wasn't exhausting her. It was clarifying her. Angela leaned over and whispered, "You doing okay?" Lena nodded once. "I've waited over a year for this. I can wait 15 more minutes." Angela smiled. "He's cracking." He thought no one would ever hold him accountable. Lena looked forward. That's what they all think, until they meet someone who's not afraid to remember. Outside in the hallway, Officer Calder paced. His lawyer was whispering to him, furiously, but Jim wasn't hearing it anymore. His mind was somewhere else, someone else. Back to that night, he remembered seeing the car, deciding to pull it over. He remembered the flicker of surprise when she wasn't afraid. When she looked him straight in the eye and spoke calmly, clearly, like she had nothing to prove. That look had gotten under his skin, and worse, the badge. That trident pin on her bag. It had reminded him of something he didn't want to admit, that he'd never served, never fought, never risked anything. But there she was, cool, capable, and twice the soldier he never was. He hadn't just reacted with bias. He'd reacted with insecurity. Inside, the teenage girl Lena had noticed earlier was still sitting quietly. Her name was Tiana. She was there for a civics class field trip, but this case, this woman, it had hit her differently. She scribbled in her notebook. She doesn't shout. She doesn't fight. She just holds her ground and lets the truth speak. 15 minutes passed. The courtroom filled again. Judge Franklin returned, more serious now, his expression unreadable. The footage and testimony raised serious questions. He said, adjusting his glasses. Questions that go beyond this case. He turned toward Lena. "Ms. Taylor, would you be willing to give a formal statement under oath regarding the events of that evening and any prior encounters with Officer Calder?" Lena stood. "Yes, Your Honor, and not just for myself." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "I've received letters," Lena said, "from 3 other veterans, all women of color, all arrested by Officer Calder, all in this city. I brought them with me." She reached into her folder and handed it to Angela, who delivered it to the bench. The judge read in silence for a moment. Then he looked at Jim. "This isn't just about you kicking a chair or roughing up one woman. This may be a pattern, a dangerous one." Jim shifted uncomfortably. "They're lying." But the judge didn't look at him anymore. His focus was on Lena. "I'm ordering a full internal review," he said, "and I'll allow this case to proceed, not as a simple hearing, but a formal civil rights inquiry." Gasps rippled again. This wasn't just a courtroom moment now. It was a ripple in a bigger story. Lena didn't smile. She just sat back down, calm as ever. Angela leaned over again. "You just changed everything," Lena whispered. "Not yet. But maybe now I'll be heard." The news spread fast. By late afternoon, Lena's name was trending on local social media. Not because she had shouted, not because she had made a scene, but because she had stood still and let the truth move around her. A quiet kind of strength. People were talking, veterans groups, civil rights advocates, even law students. But Lena wasn't paying attention to any of that. She walked out of the courthouse and into the parking lot, the sun catching her face, eyes half closed in thought. Angela walked beside her, holding a stack of files now bound for a larger review. "You think this is finally the moment?" Angela asked. Lena took a slow breath. "I think moments are just doors. It's the walking through that changes things." Behind them, a familiar voice called out, "Ms. Taylor?" They turned. It was Tiana, the teenage girl from the courtroom, She looked nervous, holding her notebook like it was a shield. I wanted to thank you, Tiana said, for not letting him win. Lena smiled gently. I didn't come here to win, sweetheart. I came to tell the truth. Tiana hesitated. I want to be like you. Strong like that. You already are, Lena said, resting a hand on her shoulder. You're here, you're watching, and you're asking questions. That's how it starts. They spoke for a few more minutes. Tiana wrote every word down. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Officer Calder sat alone in a side room. No lawyer, no audience. Just the echo of everything he'd avoided facing for years. He picked up the same trident pin that had been entered into evidence. It was scratched now. His boot had scuffed it. He stared at it like it held the answer to a question he didn't even know how to ask. Later that evening, Lena sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. A folded American flag sat on the bookshelf behind her, next to a photo of her old SEAL team. Most of them were gone now, retired, some lost. She glanced at their faces, then back at her laptop. A message had come in from a name she didn't recognize. Another woman, another story. Same officer. Lena typed back, "You're not alone. We'll walk through this together." She didn't know exactly how many women would come forward. She didn't know how long it would take, but she knew this. It was already happening. Justice wasn't a slam of a gavel. It was a slow, steady footstep in the right direction. And for the first time in a long time, Lena felt the ground shifting beneath her, not in fear, but in progress. 2 weeks passed, but the ripple didn't stop. What started as a quiet civil hearing had become the center of a growing investigation. Local news anchors referred to Lena as the SEAL who stood still. Not because she resisted, but because she didn't have to. Her silence, her calm, had become louder than any accusation. Officer Calder had been placed on administrative leave. Internal Affairs had reopened 5 prior complaints. One of those complainants, a retired Air Force medic, had refused to speak up before. But after watching Lena's footage on the news, she called the city attorney herself. Meanwhile, Lena returned to her routine. Mornings at the VA center, afternoons teaching basic wilderness training to high schoolers. She never once mentioned the court case, even though half of them had seen her face on their parents' TV screens. But the teens noticed. They noticed how she listened without interrupting, how she taught them to tie knots not for the sake of survival, but because some skills remind you you're capable, even when the world makes you feel small. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Wednesday. A thick envelope. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "Ms. Taylor, I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say this anyway. You didn't just embarrass me in court. You held up a mirror I didn't want to look into. You were calm while I was cruel. You had earned respect while I demanded it. I'm stepping down from the department. I know it won't undo the damage. But I want to start facing it. Thank you for standing tall. You didn't have to, but you did." J.C. Lena folded the note slowly. She stared at it for a moment before placing it in a small wooden box on her mantel. Inside that box were other things that mattered. Her grandmother's locket, a photo of her SEAL unit, a coin she'd found in Afghanistan that no one else had noticed. Angela called later that night. "They offered a settlement," she said. "City Council wants to avoid a full trial. They're offering money and a public apology." "I don't want money," Lena replied, voice steady. "I want a change in how they train. And I want a seat at the table when they rewrite those policies." Angela went quiet for a second. "You're incredible. You know that?" "I'm tired," Lena admitted, "but not done." That weekend, Lena was invited to speak at a local university's leadership panel. Tiana was there front row, her notebook open again. Lena took the mic and scanned the crowd. You don't have to raise your voice to lead. Sometimes being still is the loudest move you can make. But never confuse stillness with silence, and never ever confuse peace with surrender. Tiana wrote every word. And somewhere in the back of the room, another girl, one who hadn't yet spoken her truth, felt seen for the first time. Months later, change came, not all at once, not loudly, but in ways that mattered. The city's police department announced a new initiative, Veteran Awareness and Anti-Bias Training, co-designed by Lena Taylor herself. Her condition for participating had been simple. Real voices, real accountability, no performative checklists. Every officer, from rookies to captains, sat through her sessions. They listened to stories, not statistics. They heard from veterans who looked like her. Black, brown, female, tattooed, quiet, angry, graceful. All of them tired of being invisible in the very country they had defended. The first time Lena walked into the academy classroom, no one applauded, no one needed to. Her presence was enough. She stood in front of them not as a victim, not as a warning, but as a builder of something better. One afternoon, a young officer in training raised his hand. "What do we do when we realize we've been doing it wrong?" Lena didn't flinch. "Start by not defending your mistakes. Start by listening harder than you talk. Then walk into the next situation and do better. And if that feels uncomfortable, it means you're growing." Meanwhile, the city quietly made amends. 4 wrongful charges were overturned. A public acknowledgement of mishandled stops was issued. Tiana, now interning at a local journalism nonprofit, wrote a feature on Lena's story. She titled it, "The Woman Who Stood Still and Moved a City." Lena read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it next to the letter from Officer Calder in her wooden box. Not because she needed the praise, but because it meant the story had reached someone. One quiet evening, she walked out to her porch, tea in hand, as the sky turned orange over the rooftops. The neighborhood kids played nearby. A little girl across the street looked up and waved. "Hi, Miss Lena." Lena waved back. "Hey, sweetheart. Are you that hero from the news?" Lena smiled, her voice soft. "I'm just someone who didn't sit down when it mattered." The girl thought for a second, then nodded like she understood. As the sun dipped below the trees, Lena closed her eyes and breathed in the stillness. Not as a weight, but as a reward. Because in the end, it wasn't the courtroom or the camera, or even the apology that changed things. It was the choice to stand, with grace, with truth, and without shouting, long enough for the world to listen, and when it finally did, it hurt her. Moral of the story: you don't always have to fight loud battles to spark real change. Sometimes strength looks like standing still when the world expects you to fall.